Welcome to the House, Minister. Much has been discussed about what this pact does and doesn't mean to Ireland, but I think, first of all, I think we need to look at the much broader context in terms of modern migration and asylum and the deep roots of the present inequalities and injustices, and behind them, the present inequalities and injustices leading to asylum seeking and migration. We have historical injustices and oppression. War, displacement and injustice are all features of our collective history and shape the world around us today. Colonialism and the deliberate exploitation and undevelopment of many countries across the global south have created ample conditions for war and mass displacement. Displacement in the current context is actually directly related to the ravages of colonialism, largely by European countries, which left many of the countries where people now flee, countries are now fleeing, robbed of their resources and indeed their people. Not only that, but we see European powers continue to act in a colonial manner towards much of the world, whether it be through continued extraction of debt payments from former colonies, through resource extraction, which we see leading to violence and mass displacement in the Congo at the moment, or indeed through the support of repressive regimes which serve useful purposes for European powers. Looking at all of these drivers of migration, we need to be very serious and very honest about the fact that our policies in the global north are making and continuing to make and choosing to make much of the world unlivable. And it is funny, we hear sometimes that the discussion across Europe seems to be, how can we be more unwelcoming? Is the problem that we're so welcoming, we're far too welcoming? Is there ways we could make it a more miserable, an awful experience? Could we have a higher death toll in the Mediterranean? Could we have more of your family separated? Could we put you into a more miserable and painful and brutal situation of detention? And would that put you off? But the fact is, if the choice is between unwelcoming and unlivable, people will continue to travel. And the question and moral question for us will be how we treat them. The climate emergency is leading to displacement, famine and death. Lancet Planetary Health tells us that the global north was responsible for 92% of global emissions. That's 29% from the EU since 1850 to date. Whereas Malawi and other countries in the global south, in Malawi, for example, each person is producing 0.11 tonnes of carbon emissions, compared with 8 tonnes for every person in Ireland. The responsibility for the climate crisis is unequal, but so are the effects. Vulnerable groups, Indigenous peoples, women, children, the elderly and rural communities, who we hear such concern about here in Ireland, rural communities across the world, are at the front line of the climate crisis, with 36 million people right now across the Horn of Africa experiencing food insecurity because of extended droughts caused by the literal burning of our planet. And to suggest, by the way, that these asylum measures, that these measures we have, the policies we have in terms of how we treat humanity, the regime we have in terms of the right to seek asylum, was only designed to deal with a trickle of some kind and not to deal with large numbers. Surely have we completely forgotten our own famine? What should they have said in America or in Liverpool then? Sorry, we were only imagining a few people might migrate. We're sorry that thousands and millions of you are starving. Perhaps, indeed, those policies didn't imagine such large numbers because they didn't imagine the level of cruelty that could be imposed on whole populations across the world by others. We must look to the fact that our global economic system, intertwined with the climate crisis, is the key driver of migration and displacement. In countries which have been the subject of older and new forms of colonialism, indeed like structural adjustment policies, which intentionally undercut public services or the rights to basic necessities of life for populations, inequality becomes a driver of migration. And it is something to say we don't want an economic migrant, but we're happy to come and impose economic policies on your country that leave you destitute. But when you try to leave, then you're an economic migrant. It's like the economic pressures can only go one way. and we take no responsibility for what they create. We also have to look at countries in the fact that in 21st century Europe, in the 21st century, the European powers who stole the resources of many countries in such previous centuries are content to tell people they're not welcome in Europe. And now we have a new form of colonialism where very large corporations, some of which may be headquartered in Ireland, they are exerting a new form of colonialism. And we see things, for example, in those who are opening many private mines right across Africa, fueling conflict and fueling displacement at the cost environmentally and socially of the local populations. This context can't be lost, quite simply, because while we're here and we're debating the challenges of migration, like as if we're the ones experiencing the challenges of migration here in Ireland or in Europe, we have to look that in the global north, we're guiding them by the policy. And just for context, in terms of migration and displacement, the figures have been very clear. Ireland, Europe, takes a very small proportion of the world's refugees and those asylum seekers. So looking at figures from the Irish Refugee Council, the EU's share of the world's refugee population has decreased. You wouldn't think it from what we hear, but it's decreased from 70% in 1993 to under 20% since 2018. According to the UNHCR, about 74% of the world's refugees are hosted by low-income and middle-income countries. And indeed, 69% of all refugees and other persons in need of international protection live in the countries neighbouring their countries of origin. We are taking a tiny fraction of those displaced across the world, even though we bear, as Europe, a large responsibility for the drivers. So really what we're talking about is not that there's a new crisis for Europe, or that was this. What there is political opportunism, political exploitation of the narrative, and rich countries that feel like, surely we're rich enough that we shouldn't have to know about the problem or see the problem. Just to be clear, when we talk about third countries, or sometimes I think we forget, or even the third world as a phrase. Let's be clear. There is one world. There's one world. And we're on one part of it. And we're taking more of the resources than the others on it. And we're on that one world and have responsibility for how we treat others. There isn't such a thing as Europe floating in space. Pardon? Oh, yeah, sorry, apologies. There isn't such a thing as Europe floating in space, separate from its, the idea of if we can create hard enough policies and create enough deals with countries on the outside, that we should be able to insulate ourselves from knowing what chaos is being visited across the world. To go to the specifics of the pact itself. I completely agree that there should be separate votes on each legislative measure rather than the package in its entirety. I think it is undemocratic, I think it's poor practice, and I think it is a disservice to all to have put this as a single bundle with a single vote. It is a failure to face the responsibility for the detailed decisions, and I would be clear, the concerns I have on the pact are not the ones I've been written to about. My concerns are not around Ireland's share, because I think Ireland has and should have the capacity to do more and to give leadership in this area. And Ireland, in fact, with our own history of migration, should be leading in respect of these issues, with our own history of mass migration. I don't have concerns that I think it's absolutely ludicrous to suggest that Ireland is full in any sense at all. What I do think Ireland does need to do better, and that isn't around slowing the numbers of migrants, that's around having better policies, is to plan for it. And I think it's a disgrace that Housing for All failed to plan. Even at that time, we knew that we would have refugees increasing coming from Ukraine, for example, and others. There was a failure to build in housing for a new population, or a migrant population, or a refugee population into Housing for All, and I think that was remiss. And then it's being presented as a crisis that has unexpectedly arisen, rather than something that should be planned for by any proper modern country looking at global trends. So again, there are failures there. But that is not the area of the Pact I have concerns with. The area of the Pact, and I will note that at EU level over 50 civil society organisations, including Amnesty International, ActionAid, Oxfam, Save the Children, the Jesuit Refugee Services and others, have highlighted the real and serious concerns in relation to human rights. They clearly said that the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum will mirror the failed approaches of the past and worsen their consequences. There's a risk that the Pact results in an ill-functioning, costly and cruel system that falls apart on implementation and leaves critical issues unaddressed. It could normalise the arbitrary use of immigration detention, including for children and for families, increase racial profiling, use crisis procedures to enable pushbacks and return individuals to so-called safe third countries when they are in fact at risk of violence, torture and arbitrary imprisonment. The Fortress Europe mentality we've seen emerging will continue and worsen under this pact, it seems, and we have to reckon with the horror of what our EU migration policy has carried out previously in all our names. 27,000 people seeking refuge in Europe have drowned or gone missing in the Mediterranean since 2014. 27,000. Prior to 2017, Ireland could hold its head up because our naval service engaged in search and rescue missions. In 2015, our naval service rescued 8,592 people from the Mediterranean Sea. But then in 2017, we entered the EU's Operation Sophia. And at that time, in the debate with me, the Minister of State for Defence, Deputy Keogh, told the Seanad that transferring to Operation Sophia will result in the redeployment of Irish naval vessels from primarily humanitarian search and rescue operation to primarily security and interception operations. That was a choice explicitly made to stop the work we were all proud of in terms of our Navy and saving lives and switch to the security focus that underpins so many of the measures here in the Migration Pact. By 2018, the number of people rescued fell to 1,888. By 2019, they stopped search and rescue altogether. Operation Irini, the successor to Operation Sophia, has no search and rescue mandate at all. Instead, we see the Libyan Coast Guard being notified when a ship is attempting to cross, so that if people make it to the ship, they'll be returned to detention centres in Libya, where they will face horrific conditions, as documented by Sally Hayden and so many others. Indeed, it's given an imprimatur to some of the European Coast Guard, it seems, including those in Greece, to behave with an extraordinary disregard for human rights. That agreement with the EU was formalised in the 2017 Malta Declaration, which was meant to be compliance with human rights and international law. And it's one of, I have detail on the Libyan detention centres, which is harrowing, but because my time is constrained, I'm not going to go into it at this point. Though anybody only needs to look at some of the reports, some of the very well documented reports, to know that it is unconscionable that we fund it. But the partnerships that we've had have been with many countries, including also with Sudan, where European funding, including the funding of hard borders, which we're so against, supposedly, in Ireland here, but hard borders between countries in Africa, which never had hard borders between them, because we want them to act as obstacles for us in the long term. We're happy to insert hard borders and all the tensions that come with them between other countries and third countries. The asylum border regulation specifically will lead to more abuses of human rights and the hardening of the policy. The mandatory asylum border policy is inhumane. And the asylum procedure regulation, the idea that people who receive a negative decision would be deported before their appeals are heard is inhumane. It could lead to people being deported to situations of real danger in breach of their right to asylum. And I would note, we know that there are many negative decisions. I recall historically one official who used to boast about never giving a positive decision. And many people in Ireland have had their decisions overturned on appeals because of routine no's at the beginning. And I even know, as one example, one person who I supported as they sought an appeal, so bad was their original decision, it was cut and paste that he was described as a she throughout. They literally cut and paste their decision for someone else when rejecting him initially. And he only got justice at appeal stage. On the international cooperation stream, I've highlighted the reasons in terms of we should absolutely not be entering agreements with countries like Libya or indeed Tunisia, who've been accused of driving migrants to the Sahara and leaving them to die. The Pact will also lead to mass surveillance of people seeking asylum, specifically under the Schengen Borders Code reform, generalising police checks and facilitating the practice of racial profiling within the EU, which will have impacts very negatively far beyond just migrants. I want to finish by reminding everybody of this crucial context again. I finish, and thank you, Chair. According to Concern, of the 10 countries with the largest number of refugees, only 2 of those are in the European Union. We are only hosting a fraction of those seeking refuge around the world, and we have to remember that all of our laws, our original laws, come from the principle of how humanity should treat humanity. And those of us who have the capacity should be looking for ways to make the world more livable and to make our own country more welcoming, and indeed a country we could be more proud of, rather than one that acts as a fortress.